36. The irony. I say I'm going to speed run, and then I do one, skip a day, do another. Yeah, it's been busy, and I had to take a gaming break. Look now, we're on chapter 9. We only got 10 chapters. 10th chapter is short. As soon as I'm done with this video, I'm going to line up the next couple fiction books I have in mind. And I got to thinking, fiction books I have are not really, I don't have all the popular titles for my age group as a child. But I intend to pick up a few of the classics. There's Henry Reed's Babysitting Service. Actually, Henry Reed is a 4-book series. I love those little character novels where the brain, the main character has the series. I'm not sure if I'm going to read Little House or anything like that, but Tales of the 4th Grade, nothing. Again, I'm not sure. But a lot of my stories are historical fictions taking place in the colonial period. Basically was my favorite time growing up. Alright, enough of that. The Professional at Work is the title of this chapter. In Cohesive Persuasion, Edgar Sheen said, "There is a world of difference in the content of what is transmitted in religious orders, prisons, educational institutions, mental hospitals, and thought reform centers. But there are striking similarities in the manner in which influence occurs." This chapter looks at some of those similarities. The police. One of the famous cases in English criminal annals is that of the Christie murders. By the time Christie was convicted of murdering several people, another man had already been hanged for allegedly killing 2 of them. Timothy Evans' confession was completely fictitious, although it was made in all sincerity at the time. Since Evans' posthumous pardon from the crimes, it has become familiar to see items in national newspapers concerning the eliciting of confessions by police by means of pressure. One more recent example was the Confayet case, where 3 boys of subnormal intelligence confessed to the murder of a homosexual named Maxwell Confayet. They were later found to be totally innocent. How can anyone be pressured without physical torture into confessing to such a serious crime as murder, aside from those whose existential guilt or particular neurosis leads them to make unlikely confessions to any crime? Though, there are all those who will claim that some policemen force confessions that they know are untrue because they want their conviction. The Evans case, to be discussed shortly, shows that sometimes both parties can be equally deceived by events that overtake them. Sargent believes that if the right kind of stress is induced in the interview room, breakdown of the suspect is inevitable and confession elicited, whether it is true or not. He says, "To elicit confessions, one must be ready to create the feelings of anxiety and guilt, and induce states of mental conflict, if they are not already present. Even if the accused person is genuinely guilty, the normal functioning of his brain must be disturbed so that judgment becomes impaired. If possible, he must be made to feel a preference for punishment, especially if combined with a hope of salvation when it is over, rather than a continuation of the mental tension already present, or now being induced by the examiner. Whenever guilty persons make voluntary confessions to the police against their better interests, thus earning sentences of imprisonment or death, and the evidence suggests that physical violence has not been used, It is interesting to encounter whether one or more of the 4 psychological methods have been used, which were also found by Pavlov to succeed in breaking down the resistance in animals. We need to know that. You said this in the Battle of the Mind. The questions that need to be asked, he says, are whether the police examiners deliberately provoked anxiety, whether they provoked the stress to a point where the man or woman couldn't function normally any longer and became aggressively suggestible as a result, whether the subject was so confused by their changing attitudes, changing examiners, and question upon question that he lost his orientation and was led to incriminate himself, and whether any additional measures were used to weaken the suspect physically, perhaps long hours of questioning, so that his system eventually had to succumb to the combined pressures on him. Ludwig Kennedy, the great believer in Timothy Evans' innocence, wrote 10 Rillington Place, published in 1961, in an effort to get his conviction investigated. He believes that Evans' treatment and experience in custody induced the emotions which Hinkle and Wolfe found resulted from treatment to which the American POWs were subjected to in that bad place. The result in both cases was extreme suggestibility. Kennedy retells the Evans story, accenting the points along the way which seem to indicate a brainwashing experience. Evan and his wife Beryl had been living in a house where Christie and his wife were also tenants. Christie had impressed upon the pair that he had medical experience, and when Beryl became pregnant again, she had 1 child, and wanted an abortion, he had offered to see to it for her. Evans was very against the idea of an abortion, but eventually he had to acknowledge that it was going to go ahead. He even told Christie to leave for work on the fateful day that Beryl was ready for him. When Evans returned home, he learned the news that Beryl was dead, because, as he believed, the operation had been a failure. In fact, Christie had strangled her and had sex with her after her death, which had been his real intent. He helped Christie store the body out of sight, not wishing to get Christie or himself into trouble over an illegal abortion. Evans was of subnormal intelligence. It made sense to him when Christie advised him to leave the house and let him, Christie, arrange with some people he knew to look after Geraldine, the other child. Christie told Evans he would dump the body down the drain. In fact, he put it in a wash house, together with the body of the child, when he killed her too, expecting to bury both in the garden along with the other corpses he had deposited there. Evans went to stay with an aunt in Wales, but he was in a strange state, giving conflicting stories as to Beryl and the baby's whereabouts, worrying himself about what had happened and how his child was, where. He dearly loved his daughter. Eventually, in desperation to find out about his child, he went to the police. He had decided to tell them that his wife had died in an abortion, and that he himself had stuffed the body down the drain. He didn't think that this would be seen as a crime. Kennedy points out that Evans was therefore already in a state of anxiety when he went to the police. In fact, it was to put an end to the intolerable anxiety that he went to them in the first place. Then came the intolerable suspense. Evans was kept in Tideville police station while London police went to investigate the specified drain. They found nothing, of course, but they did find 2 bodies in the wash house. Evans was therefore transferred to Notting Hill police station in London. This occurred 54 hours after he had first gone to the Welsh police. All of that time, he had had no understanding of why he was being held. He had no idea that Beryl's body would not be found in the drain, and that she had met a death through strangulation, not a botched abortion. Kennedy says that he did, however, suffer the equivalent of Hinkle and Wolff's awareness that he was being avoided. He was kept in a solitary confinement in Wales, and the journey under guard to London was made in virtual silence. By this time he was certainly experiencing feelings of unfocused guilt. He knew that, if he had been firm, he could not have stopped Beryl having her abortion. If he had been firm, he could have stopped Beryl from having her an abortion, and then she would be alive. In a sense, he had therefore killed her, in his own mind. With time on his hands, and his only his anxieties about what had happened and what was happening now to occupy his mind, the formless guilt worked on him. He was full of guilt, but not guilty. Kennedy comments, "It is a well-known psychological fact that people suffering from an acute sense of guilt deliberately seek out punishment as a means of expunging it." Evans was also suffering the requisite amount of fear and uncertainty. He was terrified of Christie, terrified of what Christie would do if he thought his part in the death would come to light. Evans also expressed the fear later that the police might knock him about if he didn't make a statement that satisfied them. The next step in Evans' downfall, as Kennedy enumerates them, was bewilderment, of a very, very powerful kind. It is astonishing, says Kennedy, at this stage, how closely the events that actually happened to Evans follow the bad people's pattern of interrogation. The POWs reached a stage where they had to confess, not only for their own relief, but the bad guys knew that the confession itself would not for long be convincing to the individual who made it. Therefore, they would reject it. The POW, who believed he had finally offered what was wanted of him, was, as a result, completely bewildered and thrown into confusion anew. It would become all the more urgent for him to have his confession accepted. Therefore, he would invest more of himself into it, willing it unwittingly to be real. In Evans' case, he had made a confession. He had buried his wife in the drain. The police rejected it. He did not know that they had no reason to reject it. He did not know that they had reason to reject it, as he genuinely thought himself that his body would be found in the drain. Only later was he hit with the accusation that, far from pushing his already dead wife down a drain, he had strangled both her and Geraldine and left both bodies in the washhouse. It was the first he knew of Geraldine's death. He had believed her alive in West London. That he suffered increasing depression, fatigue, and despair was self-evident. He also wanted to talk, and therefore was dependent on his interrogators. Bad guys, with C, deliberately altered their attitude from hostility one moment to friendliness in the next, in order to confuse the prisoner. For Evans, such confusion also occurred because he had two police examiners, one of whom he liked, and the other who frightened him. His increasing suggestibility, and his need to confess, in order to achieve relief, led Evans to make the cause of the relief he felt after confession. He did not realize that he had acted to dissipate his emotions. he presumed he had unburdened himself of his crime. He even said, "It's a great relief to get it off my chest. I feel better already." The relief didn't last. In prison, the day after hearing in the magistrate's court that he was to tell in prison, the day after hearing in the magistrate's court, he was able to tell his mother that he hadn't killed his wife and daughter. Christie had done it. Also working against Evans in his interrogation was the genuine belief of the examining officers that Evans was indeed guilty. Indeed, says Kennedy, it was the very intensity of their beliefs that blinded them to things they might otherwise have seen. Do not let us forget that on the very morning of the investigation, Jennings, one of the officers, had seen with his own eyes the pathetic little bundle that was Geraldine lying behind the washhouse door. Oh my. One of the things they might otherwise have seen was the true nature of the piece of evidence which proved beyond a doubt that Evans could not have put the bodies in the washhouse on the day he confessed to putting them there. Over the period of time in question, building work was being carried out at 10 Rillington Place. The evidence of the building works manager, the plasterer, and the plasterer's maid, who had gone in and out of the washhouse, showed that no body could have been there on the date it was supposedly deposited, before Evans' departure to Wales. The wood that was found covering them had not been given to Christie until a week later. Police officers were also convinced of Evans' guilt, that at no point did their minds turn to wondering about Christie's role in all of this. Instead, they called in the builders and interrogated them all separately. The builders were obliged to wait for hours before they were seen, and were then grilled for lengthy periods. The outcome was that the men eventually conceded that they must have been mistaken about the dates. A timesheet that showed quite clearly the truth of the first statements, and which had been given to the police, was never seen again. It's the only timesheet missing from the firm's records over the relevant 5-year period. What do you suppose? They said, we don't want to see this, so we're going to hide it from ourselves. Bury it, I want this guy. Why do you want that guy? Why are you so hell-bent on that? You lie. You lied to yourself, and you gave him bad justice. Pardon me. In mental seduction and menticide, Merleau makes the point that those charming characters who are easily able to influence others are often extremely susceptible to suggestion themselves. Sargent makes the same point for a different reason when he explains how confessions can come to be believed by both suspect and accuser. This is because the examiner first suggests to the prisoner that he is guilty of a crime and tries to convince him, if he is not already convinced, that this is so. Even if the prisoner is innocent, the long tension to which he has been subjected may well have already frightened him into suggestibility, and if he were an unstable type, he may then accept the examiner's view of his guilt. If the examination is pressed, he may even begin, as it were, to play back an old record, confessing to crimes suggested by the police in earlier cross-examinations. The police, forgetting that the incidents were originally their own guesswork, are deceived. The prisoner has now spontaneously confessed what they had been suspecting all along. It is not usually realized that fatigue and anxiety induce suggestibility in the examiner as well as the prisoner. The task of eliciting confessions is a very difficult and trying one, and that they can delude each other into belief in the genuineness of a confessed crime. Merleau explains such a phenomenon by the fact that the interrogation process induces a hypnotic state in the suspect. The suspect is able to produce bits and pieces of the confession wanted from him because the passive memory often remembers facts learned under hypnosis better than those learned under a state of alert consciousness. Let's keep going till the end of this paragraph. Kennedy says, in such a way, Evans certainly succeeded in brainwashing his examiners. What Jennings and Black, the police officers, gave to him, he gave back to them, and not only to them, but to others in positions of even greater authority. Zimbardo points out that the American police have used psychology to refine their interrogation techniques, not, of course, to elicit false confessions, but in the belief that such tactics would uncover true ones from otherwise intransient subjects. He lists the categories these tactics fall into. The environment is manipulated so that it denies the psychological support offered by any element of familiarity. Ideally, there should be no ashtrays or a telephone. The suspect's perception of the crime is manipulated. He may be led to believe it isn't very serious. The relationship between the interrogator and the subject is manipulated. The interrogator may stand over the subject or demonstrate disquieting composure in the face of the subject's unease. He may also play on the subject's needs in order to establish a relationship, for example, by flattering an insecure person or playing up in himself characteristics which he believes the suspect admires. The interrogator also learns to manipulate words, changing them with the required emotion, or using words like mother, which can elicit certain emotions. All weak points are carefully exploited. Unfortunately, all such tactics, designed to enable an interrogator to get the truth of a matter, can equally well operate to obscure it. In England, it is now illegal for the police to interrogate a mentally handicapped person without an independent witness present. Well, that is an advance, a concession to the fact that people of subnormal intelligence can be manipulated, even unintentionally, into confessing what is not the case. It almost, by very omission, implies that a person of normal intelligence could not be forced into a similar trap. But that's not true, folks. Okay? Be back in a while.